It wasn't supposed to happen like that. The plan was clean, precise, and backed by satellite intelligence and confirmed by thermal imaging. Infiltrate, sweep, exfil in under 30 minutes. That's how these missions were designed. Controlled chaos, but chaos with limits. 4 men, trained for silence, for violence, for every variable that war could throw at them. Except this. Except the moment the tunnel collapsed, and the only exit behind them vanished in a thunder of dust and rock. In that moment, the plan ceased to exist, and all that remained was instinct. They had just entered, 12 minutes in, barely past the initial chamber. No contact yet, no signs of resistance. And then, without warning, the world beneath their feet shifted. The explosion wasn't large, but it was precise, methodical, placed with intent. The kind of intent that doesn't aim to kill immediately. It aims to trap, to break down, to wear away. The blast sealed the tunnel behind them, cutting off their comms, their backup, their air. In seconds, the 4-man SEAL team was plunged into total darkness. The kind that has weight, that feels like it breathes. The dust was thick, choking. Light beams from their headlamps cut through it like knives in fog, revealing nothing but the swirl of collapse. They called out, confirmed who was still alive. One was already gone, crushed by the falling ceiling, buried where he stood. The others, disoriented and bleeding, pressed forward because that was all they could do. The mission, if it still existed, lay ahead. Behind them was nothing but rubble. No signal, no satellite, no one on the other end of the line. But what none of them said aloud, not in those first minutes, not in the hours that followed, was the truth they all felt deep in their chest. They had walked into something ancient, something that did not want them there. The tunnel wasn't just stone and earth. It was a trap built on knowledge. Knowledge of how they'd think, how they'd move, where they'd go. And it had been waiting. Now, with the walls pressing in and the silence tightening like a noose, they understood. This wasn't a mission anymore. It was a test, a punishment, a descent, and no one was coming to get them. The mission began like many others before it, under a sky veiled in moonless dark, with the rhythmic thump of rotor blades muffled by altitude and silence. They had trained for this environment, rehearsed every possible variable in the kill house, and reviewed satellite imagery of the compound and surrounding terrain until it was etched into memory. Their target was a suspected insurgent command node buried beneath a village that had been abandoned for years. At least, that's what the briefing claimed. Intelligence from drones and field assets had confirmed enemy presence underground, a fortified tunnel system believed to be used for weapons smuggling and storing sensitive materials. But most importantly, signals intercepted just days before indicated there might be captives, possibly hostages, held inside. That made the operation a priority. The 4-man SEAL team had been selected not just for their skill, but for their cohesion. They weren't just operators. They were a unit that had survived Kandahar, Helmand, and countless unnamed engagements. Leading them was Senior Chief Petty Officer Daniel Reyes, call sign Grizzly, a veteran with 16 years of field experience and a scar across his jaw that said more about survival than any badge. The rest of the team included Vickers, the comms and tech specialist, Mac, a breacher with a knack for reading architecture like a language, and Foster, the youngest but no less capable, a designated marksman with a surgeon's patience. Together, they had less than 3 hours to infiltrate, verify intel, locate any captives, neutralize threats, and exfil. Ideally without leaving a trace. The drop zone was nearly silent. The Black Hawk hovered low, about 15 feet off the ground, stirring up only minimal debris thanks to the cool, damp earth. One by one, the team fast roped down onto the outskirts of the objective area, their boots landing without a sound. No dogs barked, no lights flickered in the distance. Even the wind was quiet, almost as if the world had been turned down to a low hum. Using hand signals, they moved swiftly across the terrain, avoiding open ground, keeping low and tight through the undulating contours of ancient farmland, now overgrown with dry brush and thorny vegetation. The tunnel entrance had been found 2 days earlier by reconnaissance assets, half covered by debris, appearing from the air to be nothing more than a collapsed animal burrow. On the ground, it told a different story. Weathered wooden slats framed the entry, reinforced with rebar and sandbags placed not for defense, but concealment. Max swept it for tripwires and pressure plates, methodically, even though time was thin. It came up clean, at least visibly. That didn't guarantee safety. Nothing did down here. The temperature dropped the moment they stepped within 10 feet of the entrance. The air had a wet mineral taste, and the first breath inside already felt like it belonged to someone else. Reyes was the first to enter. Sweeping left, headlamp low and wide, M4 tucked close to his shoulder. Vickers followed, then Mac, then Foster. The tunnel descended at a slight angle, enough to strain the knees but not enough to suggest a deep cave. The walls were rough-hewn stone in some areas, but parts were reinforced with old Soviet-era materials, rusted sheet metal, wooden beams with faded Cyrillic warnings, and even one section of corrugated roofing now used as ceiling insulation. Whoever had expanded this place had done so over decades. It wasn't just a tunnel. It was a system, maybe even a network. They advanced slowly, silently, careful not to disturb anything. Each step was deliberate, measured, almost rehearsed. They had trained for hours in simulated environments back in North Carolina. Tunnel clearances, low-light combat drills, dead-air comms practice, but nothing fully prepared you for the real thing. The dust here was fine, like ash, and it clung to their gear, their gloves, the inside of their mouths. It made every breath feel like it carried weight. About 30 meters in, they reached a junction. A side tunnel broke off to the right, narrower, darker. Mac deployed a bore scope camera to peer inside. Nothing. No movement. No heat signatures. But that didn't mean it was empty. The team continued down the primary path, deeper into the dark. They moved with the kind of discipline that came not from fear, but from experience. It wasn't nerves that made their movements deliberate. It was memory. The memory of what happens when you let speed outrun caution. The deeper they went, the more the space around them changed. The walls grew tighter, but more structured. You could tell by the way sound moved. Echoes shortened. Footfalls dampened. It wasn't natural. Someone had designed this part with intention, to control how sound traveled, to limit sightlines, to funnel anyone entering into a choke point. That was the first red flag. Reyes signaled a full stop and tapped twice on the comms line. Static. Vickers tried the backup frequency. Nothing. Their signal was dead. Whether from interference, the depth, or intentional jamming, they were now dark. Foster's breathing grew louder in the team's shared silence, not from panic, but from readiness, the kind of breath you take before everything goes wrong. Still, there was no enemy in sight, no movement, no sounds but their own. Reyes gave the order to advance. The group reformed and pushed another 15 meters in. That was when the hallway shifted again. The floor was no longer flat. A slight incline downward formed beneath their feet, and the walls narrowed into a structure that no longer felt improvised. Concrete gave way to old brick, then metal mesh, like the inside of a buried shipping container. The air turned stale, metallic, and still. Too still. No movement of air, no living current. They were in the lung of something that had long since stopped breathing. That was the last thing any of them processed before the world cracked open. A sharp metallic snap echoed from behind them. Then heat, then pressure, then the roar of the earth itself collapsing in a single brutal exhale. The tunnel entrance was gone. The blast wave ripped through the tunnel like a silent hammer. There was no bright flash, no cinematic fireball. Just sudden, crushing force, like the air had collapsed on itself and then rushed outward in a violent gasp. Dust exploded in every direction, coating everything in a choking gray cloud, reducing visibility to less than a meter. The floor buckled beneath their boots, and the walls groaned with the weight of shifting stone and timber. One of the support beams near the entrance sheared off completely, dropping part of the ceiling in a heavy cascade of rock and metal that sealed the way they'd come. The team was thrown into chaos. Reyes was slammed against the tunnel wall, shoulder first, his night vision goggles cracking as his helmet scraped stone. Vickers hit the ground face first, arms over his gear, already trying to process the situation. Mac was buried beneath a mix of dust and debris, partially pinned but conscious. Foster had been farthest back and took the worst of the shockwave. He wasn't moving. It all happened in seconds, but the aftermath stretched like a slow bleed through time. The silence after the collapse wasn't calm. It was suffocating, the kind of silence that follows trauma. The moment your ears are ringing and your brain is trying to reboot. Then came the coughing, the movement, the low rasp of gear shifting against stone as the survivors began to reorient themselves. Reyes shook off the dizziness, instinct taking over, checking his team, one by one, through hand signals and broken whispers. Foster's vitals were weak, pulse shallow, a gash across his temple leaking blood into the dust. They were cut off. No signal, no backup, no air circulation, and no sound from outside. Whatever had brought down the tunnel wasn't just an accident. It was deliberate. They hadn't been the ones making the first move. They were being drawn in, funneled like prey. Reyes motioned to regroup, and the team dragged Foster behind a fractured beam while they assessed the structural integrity of what remained. The tunnel ahead was still intact, but the collapse behind had changed everything. The atmosphere had thickened. The air smelled not just of dust and carbon, but of oil, sweat, and something older, something like decay. Vickers, despite a split brow and a dislocated finger, scanned for thermal signatures ahead. Nothing registered, but the interference was heavy. Shadows warped against the walls. Light no longer behaved the way it should. They moved, not because it was the right decision, but because it was the only one. Forward was the only option. Every sound they made echoed twice, once ahead, once behind, like something unseen was imitating them. Their steps were slower now, cautious, rifles raised, eyes darting across every dark crack and corner. The architecture of the tunnel began to change again, subtly, but with intent. The floor became more uneven, with shallow pits and ridges that made footing unpredictable. The walls narrowed just slightly, enough to restrict lateral movement and force the team into a tighter stack. Every few meters the light from their gear dimmed more, not by battery drain, but by density in the air, thicker now, as if saturated with dust or gas or something more abstract. Then they saw it, a shape at the edge of their light, a blur, gone in a blink, but real. Reyes halted, signaled a scan, but nothing came back. The quiet resumed, pressing harder now, like the tunnel itself was waiting. That's when the first shot rang out, sharp, close, and deliberate. It didn't come from ahead, it came from above, the ceiling. A hatch they hadn't noticed burst open, and the ambush began. Figures dropped like shadows, fast and silent, weapons raised. The team responded instantly, their reflexes automatic, but the disadvantage was total. From a superior angle, in confined space, the enemy had every tactical edge. The first round hit Vickers in the arm, spinning him into the wall. Another grazed Mac's side, piercing his plate but not deep. Reyes dropped to one knee and fired upward, catching one of the attackers mid-fall and sending him crumpling to the ground. The firefight erupted in a strobe of muzzle flashes, blinding against the dark. Every shot illuminated fractured walls, desperate faces, bleeding stone. Bullets pinged and sparked, shattering loose rock and slicing the air inches from skin. Mac rolled beneath a collapsed section and returned fire, managing to wound another attacker who fell backward into the ceiling gap, screaming as he disappeared from view. Foster regained partial consciousness during the firefight, moaning softly. Reyes crawled to him, shielding him with his body, while Vickers reloaded with trembling hands. The enemy began to retreat, not in panic but with control, pulling back into the shaft above. One last grenade dropped into the tunnel, non-lethal, smoke-based, but it was enough to blind the team and buy their attackers time to vanish. And just like that, it was over. The tunnel was quiet again, filled with haze and the echoes of gunfire still ringing in their heads. 3 of them were bleeding. 1 was half-conscious. And now, with the dust settling, the truth became clearer. They were being hunted. Not in the open, not on a battlefield, but in a maze built for this. Their entry had been anticipated, their route calculated. Every twist and turn led them deeper into something designed to manipulate, contain, and exhaust. They weren't just trapped. They were being studied. And whoever was watching, waiting, orchestrating, wasn't finished. Not yet. The smoke from the last grenade still clung to the walls like a second skin as the team huddled in the settling silence, their gear coated in soot, sweat, and blood. Foster was conscious again, barely, eyes glazed and unfocused, lips dry and split. Vickers tightened a compression wrap around his own arm while glancing at his malfunctioning comms unit. Mac was on one knee, watching the ceiling where the last attacker had vanished, rifle steady but breath ragged. Reyes took it all in. Their injuries, their exhaustion, the unnatural way the tunnel seemed to distort time and noise, and knew without a doubt that staying put would only make them easier prey. He made the call without words. A hand gesture. A direction, forward. It was the only choice. The mission, buried beneath the layers of confusion and violence, still stood. The hostage had not been confirmed dead. And until that was known, nothing else mattered. They moved in silence, wounded and waited, their steps slow and deliberate as they advanced deeper into the black. The tunnel shifted again, subtly, as if sensing their persistence and responding with more complexity. The air grew heavier. The ground dipped further. and the stone changed in texture, from rough and broken to smooth and damp, like they were no longer in something man-made but carved, as if by time itself, or something that mimicked it. They passed remnants of life, not recent life. Decayed rations, torn cloth pinned beneath rubble, an empty shell casing of a type they didn't use. A gas mask discarded against a collapsed arch, melted and brittle. The temperature dropped, bit by bit, until the sweat on their necks turned cold. The tunnel widened just slightly ahead, the walls drawing back like lungs exhaling. And for a moment, it felt as though space itself was bracing for what came next. Then, the sound. It was faint at first, so soft it could have been mistaken for the groaning of rock or the echo of their own footsteps. But then it repeated. A whimper, human, fragile, real. Reyes raised a fist. Everyone stopped, weapons lifted, scanning the darkness ahead with rifle-mounted lights now flickering at half strength. The noise came again, closer now, but still muffled. A cry, high-pitched and shivering, buried under layers of fear. They advanced toward the sound, navigating a narrow curve that opened into a chamber recessed beneath the slope of the earth. It was smaller than expected, perhaps 10 feet across, but enough to house what had been hidden there. In the corner, half covered by a hanging tarp and shackled to rusted piping, was the girl. Dirt streaked her skin. Her wrists were bound. Her mouth was covered with cloth, her breathing frantic and uneven. Eyes wide, glassy, darting to each figure that entered with the terror of someone who had lost the ability to distinguish between rescue and threat. Reyes moved first, low and steady, weapon lowered, voice soft. She flinched, recoiling against the wall. He used his knife to cut the bindings, and as he did, her hands immediately went to her throat as if to protect it, her body caving in on itself. Vickers swept the rest of the room while Max stood watch at the tunnel entrance. No immediate threats, no movement, just the girl and the endless stillness beyond. She couldn't speak. Whether from trauma, dehydration, or both, her voice wouldn't rise above a whisper. But her eyes told the story. There were others, or there had been. The signs of confinement were everywhere. Shredded clothing, plastic water containers, crude bedding fashioned from rags and insulation. She wasn't the only one who'd been here. But she was the only one left. The space felt wrong, not just because of what it was used for, but how it was built. The walls were reinforced, the air vented. Barely, but enough to suggest long-term occupation. This wasn't a makeshift cell. It had been prepared. For days, weeks, maybe months. The thought sent a cold ripple through Reyes's chest. They had come here for a tactical strike, a recovery mission. But what they had found was something more organized, more deliberate, and far more human than enemy logistics suggested. Someone had built this space to hold people like her, and they had known they'd be discovered eventually. As Max stepped into the chamber to assist, the girl's body tensed. Her hand reached out, shaking, thin fingers brushing the ground. Then she pointed weakly to the wall, behind the hanging tarp. Reyes moved it aside, slowly. Behind it was a tunnel shaft, narrower than the others, with ladder rungs leading straight up and out of sight. But it wasn't escape she had pointed to. It was the hatch at the top. Closed. Locked. Blood smeared on the bottom rung. There had been movement recently. Someone had left through there, or watched them arrive. Maybe both. Reyes stared at it for a moment too long, absorbing what it meant. They weren't just late. They had been expected. Time was running out. The girl was too weak to walk. Vickers fashioned a sling from his harness. Reyes secured her against his chest, tightening the straps, adjusting his rifle across his back. Foster was still semi-lucid, his condition worsening. Mac rigged a makeshift stretcher from 2 broken beams and some cord. The exit strategy was no longer strategy. It was survival. As they prepared to move again, Reyes looked around the chamber one last time. There was a feeling, heavy, electric, indescribable, like they had found something they were never meant to see. Not just the hostage, not just the room, but the truth that this place wasn't an accident. It was a system, a mechanism, and they had just tripped something deep inside it. The girl shivered against him as they turned back into the dark. They weren't out, not even close. But now they had her, and now someone else knew they were still alive. The girl's breath was shallow and fast against Reyes's chest as he secured the final strap of the makeshift harness, her heartbeat fluttering through layers of cloth and sweat-drenched gear. She was so light it barely felt like carrying a person, more like lifting a memory, something fragile and unfinished. The rest of the team repositioned quickly, moving in silence, the urgency unspoken but shared. Foster was fading fast, his skin pallid, lips dry, a distant haze behind his eyes that looked more like surrender than exhaustion. Mac and Vickers hauled him as gently as possible, using the improvised stretcher, stepping over debris, moving as one. But the moment they passed through the threshold of the chamber and back into the tunnel system, it was clear they wouldn't make it far before things turned worse. The air had changed again. It was no longer stale but charged, like the space ahead had been disturbed. The tunnel was quiet, but it wasn't still. There was motion in the darkness, just beyond the reach of their flickering headlamps. Shadows that hesitated when the light approached, then slipped back into the black. The narrow corridor ahead bent sharply to the left, and from around that bend came the faintest tremor in the ground, like a vibration with no source. A tension, humming low and constant, that sank into their boots and moved up through their bones. Reyes slowed, adjusting the girl's weight, eyes locked on the corner ahead. The others mirrored his posture. Something was coming. Not a patrol, not a scattered group of insurgents responding in panic. This had shape and timing. It was coordinated. It was waiting for them to step into the right spot. The ambush broke in an instant. From two angles, one ahead, one above, gunfire erupted, the confined space amplifying the cracks into deafening percussive bursts. Dust and rock exploded from the walls as bullets tore through the passage. Reyes threw himself sideways, shielding the girl with his back as he slammed into the tunnel wall. Mac dropped to a knee, firing in controlled bursts toward the muzzle flashes flaring in the dark. Vickers scrambled to drag Foster out of the line of fire, returning rounds with one hand while trying to keep his wounded teammate from rolling off the stretcher. The enemy had numbers, more than before. At least 6 fighters pressed from the front, another 3 using an overhead crawl space to pour rounds downward in tight arcs. One of them dropped a fragmentation grenade into the passage, and it landed near Mac's position. With no time to think, he kicked it hard into a side recess just as it detonated. The blast echoed through the shaft, throwing dust and light and shrapnel in every direction. Mac caught a piece on the shoulder and went down hard, blood seeping fast into the dirt. Reyes, disoriented but mobile, drew his sidearm with his left hand, his right arm numb from the earlier hit, and laid down suppressing fire while dragging the girl toward a shallow depression in the wall. He felt the impact of bullets hitting stone inches from his head, fragments biting into his cheek, but he didn't stop. The girl was screaming now, a high, raw sound that barely cut through the noise. He used his own body to cover her entirely, wrapping himself around her like armor. Vickers screamed something unintelligible over the comms, but it was drowned out by the return of the enemy's push. 2 fighters sprinted into view, firing from the hip, moving low and fast. Reyes took one down with 2 shots to the chest. The other went wide and flanked right. Before Reyes could shift position, the attacker was nearly on top of them. Then, a single shot cracked from behind. Mac, wounded but conscious, had pulled himself up and fired from the ground, dropping the fighter mid-stride. He slumped beside the wall, rifle slipping from his hands, blood pooling from his arm and side. The firefight stretched into what felt like an eternity. The tunnel filled with heat and dust and the sharp chemical sting of gunpowder. The team was running low on ammo, their movements slowing, breath ragged. Every second became a calculation. Every shot had to count. Reyes pulled another mag from his vest, shoved it into the pistol, checked the girl. She was shaking but alive, and pushed forward. They needed an escape route. Then Vickers spotted it. Off to the left, a narrow offshoot in the tunnel, partially collapsed but passable. Reyes didn't hesitate. He gave the signal, and one by one they broke formation and moved. Mac limping, Vickers dragging Foster. Reyes last with the girl still pressed to his chest. The enemy followed, slower now, cautious after their casualties. They weren't just trying to kill them. They were trying to box them in, force a surrender. But Reyes wasn't interested in options. The side tunnel was tighter, darker, more unstable, but it curved upward. That meant elevation. That meant hope. They pushed through with their last reserves of strength, tripping over stone, sliding on debris, ducking under crumbled support beams. Behind them, the gunfire thinned but didn't stop. The enemy was advancing again. Then came the final push. The tunnel opened into a wider chamber, cracked and partially exposed to open air, a shaft overhead leading to a collapsed vent. Reyes saw moonlight through the gap. Real light, not the flicker of their gear. He shoved the girl upward, boosting her onto a pile of rubble, then followed. Mac helped from below, steadying Vickers as he climbed with Foster slung across his shoulders like a sandbag. A final burst of gunfire cracked below, striking stone near Mac's legs. He turned, fired a full mag into the darkness, then scrambled up with Reyes pulling him the last meter. The team collapsed in a heap under the faint glow of night. The shooting stopped. Below them, the tunnel remained quiet. For a moment, there was only breath. Then Vickers, lying flat on his back, hit the emergency beacon on his vest. A sharp pulse blinked in the dark. The sky above flickered with movement. Rotors, faint and far, but coming closer. They had survived the last corner of hell. Barely. But they weren't safe yet, and one of them wasn't moving. Reyes crawled to Mac, who was slumped over the stone, blood coating his side. He was still breathing, but shallowly. The girl huddled beside a rock, knees pulled to her chest, eyes locked on the men around her, every sound triggering a tremor in her limbs. The extraction was inbound, but they had paid for every step out of that tunnel with pain, blood, and a piece of themselves they'd never get back. The shootout had ended. But the cost was only beginning to settle. The rotor wash hit them long before the bird itself came into view. The sound grew from a low thrum to a full-body vibration, pulsing through the stone in their chests like an approaching thunderstorm. Reyes tilted his head back and caught sight of it breaking through the clouds, a dark silhouette against the silver-blue glow of a dying night sky. It banked once, slowly, then descended with surgical control toward the exposed patch of rock where the team had surfaced. The relief was mechanical, not emotional. Numb acknowledgement that their signal had been received, and that someone, somewhere, had answered the call. There was no energy left for gratitude. Every man left was on the edge of collapse. Reyes cradled the girl closer as the dust picked up, wrapping his arms tighter around her frail body, shielding her eyes from the spray of loose dirt and gravel kicked up by the downwash. She was shivering uncontrollably, the adrenaline that had carried her this far beginning to break down into pure shock. Vickers moved first, waving an arm, dragging his body to the edge of the landing zone to signal their exact position. His face was hollow, eyes red-rimmed, the dressing on his arm soaked through and dripping. He didn't look like a soldier anymore. He looked like someone who'd crawled out of the underworld and had no idea what day it was. The helo didn't touch down fully, just hovered a few feet off the ground, its side door already open. Inside, 2 medics were already reaching out, harnesses clipped, shouting through comms as Reyes hoisted the girl upward. One of the medics grabbed her, pulling her gently into the cabin, wrapping a blanket around her before she even hit the seat. Reyes followed next, nearly falling back off the skid as his legs gave out for a moment. He caught himself, teeth gritted, arms trembling. Behind him, Vickers and Mac pushed Foster up with everything they had left. Foster's eyes were closed now, but his chest was still rising. Each breath looked like a battle won. The medics moved quickly. IVs in, bandages changed, airway cleared. No time for questions, no debrief. Just triage under fire conditions, treating trauma in a steel box with nothing but gravity and noise outside. Mac was the last to climb aboard, his body almost giving out as he reached the door. Reyes reached down and hauled him the last foot, their shoulders slamming together as the helo banked hard and lifted off into the night. For a moment, no one spoke. The cabin was loud, too loud for conversation. But that wasn't the reason for the silence. The 4 men, battered and broken, sat in a kind of stunned paralysis. Each one was lost somewhere behind their own eyes, reliving moments they hadn't yet processed. There were bruises on their skin that wouldn't show until morning, bones cracked that they hadn't even noticed. But more than that, there were fractures beneath the surface, things torn loose in the dark that no medic would ever see. The pilot made a sharp turn toward the extraction point, a forward operating base less than 20 minutes away. The flight was short, but it felt endless. Reyes sat with his back to the bulkhead, head tilted up, eyes closed, breathing through his mouth like he was afraid to inhale too deeply. He could still feel the heat of the tunnel walls, the pressure of stone closing in, the echoes of gunfire in that final chamber where they had nearly bled out before clawing their way into air. His body ached in places he couldn't name. His right arm was locked at the elbow, the nerves deadened from blood loss. His leg had cramped into a half-bent position, but he didn't dare stretch it for fear that it would simply fail. The girl was alive. That fact looped in his mind, even as every other detail blurred. She sat now between the medics, IV line in one arm, oxygen mask over her face, a blanket around her thin shoulders. She hadn't said a word since being lifted into the helo. She stared straight ahead, unmoving, her eyes locked on something only she could see. Maybe a memory, maybe a void. The trauma had carved into her deep, and Reyes could feel its weight pressing out from her like cold air. But she was alive. He had gotten her out. That fact alone was the anchor holding him together. As the base came into view, rows of floodlights piercing the dark concrete landing pads, armed personnel waiting near the medbay doors, the reality of survival began to settle in. But it didn't bring peace. Just stillness. The kind of stillness that follows shock. The helo touched down. The cabin filled with movement again. The medics moved first, lifting the girl onto a gurney and rushing her out. Another team boarded to assist with Foster, who was barely hanging on, his pulse thready, lips purple. Mac and Vickers helped, then collapsed into waiting arms. Reyes didn't move until someone called his name twice. He stood slowly, pain radiating from his back and hip, and stepped out into the lights. The base was alive with motion. Soldiers rushing, orders shouted, engines humming. But Reyes didn't hear any of it. The world had dulled into slow motion, soundless and soft. He walked like a man underwater, past the medics, past the questions, past the outstretched clipboards and waving hands. He wasn't running from responsibility. He had just already given everything he had to give. Eventually, someone guided him to a cot, sat him down, gave him water. He drank, but didn't taste it. He watched the doors to the medbay. One closed, then another. Then he was alone with the white noise of generators and the distant static of radios. Somewhere in the sky, the same wind that had carried them in was now just wind again. And the tunnel, its darkness, its silence, its weight, was still with him. Not a memory, not a dream, but something stitched into him now. A second skin, an invisible scar. They had made it out. But the escape wasn't a triumph. It was just an ending, and endings rarely come clean. They kept him in the field hospital for 72 hours under constant watch. Blood transfusions, nerve monitoring, fluid replacement, stitching deep muscle tears that had started to fester in the humid tunnel air. Reyes floated in and out of awareness, his body doing the work his mind was no longer willing to manage. When he was conscious, the room felt too bright, the ceiling too low, and the air too clean to be real. Each time he blinked, the white walls flickered into rough stone, and the fluorescent lights above him pulsed like muzzle flashes echoing off concrete. He knew where he was. He just didn't trust it. It would take weeks before the medics stopped referring to his survival as improbable. The girl was flown out first. Stable but severely malnourished. She didn't speak for days. Her mind seemingly locked behind a door no one had the key to. A psychologist assigned to her case described it as dissociative silence, a mental separation built for survival. It would take months of care, patience, and quiet for her to speak in full sentences again. When she finally did, the first words were about Reyes. Not about what had been done to her. Not about the others she had been held with, or the men who had guarded the tunnels, but about him. How he carried her, shielded her, bled for her, and how she thought he was dead until the helicopter door opened and the light hit his face. That was the moment she believed she was safe. That memory was the only one she held on to. Back at the base, Mac underwent surgery to remove shrapnel from his side. The damage to his shoulder would end his combat career. Vickers recovered quickly, physically at least. He returned to the field after 2 months, but never rejoined the same team. He said it was temporary, said he needed time. Everyone knew it wasn't. Foster stayed in intensive care for 11 days before his condition stabilized. He would survive, but he'd never walk unassisted again. His spinal trauma was permanent. The debrief lasted less than an hour. It was procedural, impersonal, conducted by men in pressed uniforms who hadn't bled in the dark or tasted earth choking in their throats. Reyes recounted the timeline mechanically. Entry, collapse, initial contact, movement through the lower shaft, hostage confirmation, final engagement, extraction. Each detail was checked, noted, recorded. There was no room for uncertainty in their process, but plenty of room for things that could never be written down, like how the tunnel felt alive, how the air breathed when they didn't, or how the silence had followed them out like a parasite, whispering back to them through every quiet moment since. A citation followed weeks later, a Distinguished Service Cross second only to the Medal of Honor. No cameras, no stage, just a quiet ceremony behind closed doors. A general shook his hand. Someone read a statement. Words like gallantry, heroism, and valor filled the space. Reyes nodded. He didn't hear most of it. He was watching the girl, seated beside a social worker in the corner, her small frame wrapped in a clean jacket, her hands folded tight in her lap. She smiled at him once. That moment landed heavier than any metal could. He didn't go home right away. There was rehab first, then mandatory rest, then counseling. He showed up to every appointment, on time, cooperative, said the right things, smiled when appropriate, reassured the right people, told the stories they wanted to hear, left out the ones they didn't. When they asked how he was sleeping, he said fine. When they asked about dreams, he said none. But the truth lived in the moments between. In the half-second it took him to react to loud noises, in the way his fingers twitched toward a rifle that wasn't there when someone stepped too close, in the way he still walked like he was underground, head tilted to track threats, shoulders curled inward, as though the weight of the tunnel was still pressing down. Back in his quarters, he started packing his gear again. Not because he had orders, but because something inside him needed to be ready. The thought of being unarmed made his skin crawl. He didn't want to fight again. He just didn't know how to stop. The team had been dissolved temporarily. Reassignment was inevitable. The brass said they were restructuring. That usually meant spreading out survivors, dispersing trauma so it didn't concentrate in one place. He reread the after-action report once. Just once. It felt like reading fiction. Like someone else had lived it. The phrasing was clean, clinical, lacking the sweat and dirt and blood that had soaked every step of that tunnel. There was no mention of the hallucinations, of the way time bent underground, of the way death had stood beside them without ever touching them until the very last second. There was no line item for what they'd left behind, for what Reyes still carried every time he blinked in the dark. A week later, he found himself sitting at the edge of his bunk, staring at the rifle laid across his lap. It wasn't loaded. It didn't need to be. His fingers moved across it out of habit, cleaning parts that were already clean, reassembling components that hadn't been touched. He wasn't waiting for orders. He wasn't even thinking about war. He was just existing in a space that felt familiar. The silence wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was expected. Sometimes, late at night, he still heard her voice. The girl, barely a whisper, calling out through the dust. Not in fear, in trust. That moment, more than the firefights, more than the weight of wounded men, more than the sound of collapsing earth, was what stayed. That she had believed in him. That her faith had not been misplaced. He knew others had died in that tunnel. Victims never found, names never known, graves never marked. He thought of them often, not as ghosts but as presence, as witnesses to a moment that he had lived through and would never escape. Some called it a miracle, that he survived 9 bullets, that the girl made it out, that the team came back at all. Reyes never used that word, not because he didn't believe in miracles, but because what happened in that place wasn't divine. It was dirty, brutal, human. He survived not because of luck or angels, but because when everything else broke down, when blood soaked his gear and air burned his lungs and the world shrank to the shape of a tunnel, he refused to stop moving. And that refusal cost him more than pain. It cost him a part of himself that still lives down there. In the dark, waiting, silent, unfinished.